Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Mark Kilroy was a bright, athletic college student, a pre-med major with a promising future, blowing off steam on a spring break getaway to the sun-drenched border town of Matamoros, Mexico. But somewhere between the neon-lit bars and crowded streets, Mark vanished without a trace. At first, it looked like another spring break gone wrong, just a kid who wandered off. But what investigators would uncover the next few weeks was darker, stranger, and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Buried in the desert was a secret ranch, a bloodstained altar, and the remains of a human sacrifice performed by a cult that believed death could make them invisible to law enforcement. This isn't just a story of murder. It's a story of black magic, cartel power, and how one young man's disappearance unraveled a ritualistic killing spree that shocked the world. It was March 1989, a time when the Cold War was thawing and hair metal reigned supreme. Madonna's Like a Prayer topped the charts. Cassette tapes rattled in car stereos, and rents were cheap enough to make every weekend feel endless. Across Texas, college kids poured southward for spring break. By day, they lapped up sunshine on South Padre Island beaches, tanned and carefree, tuning into volleyball games on the sand, sipping cheap beers, and watching the Miss Tan Line contest under blazing Gulf skies. By night, they ventured across the Gateway Bridge into Matamoros, Mexico, chasing excitement, cheap drinks, and the sense of a world that felt just out of reach. By 1989, Matamoros had become one of the top destinations for American students, an unpolished jewel across the border where the drinking age was 18, alcohol flowed freely, and nightlife stretched into the early hours. Nearly 150,000 students would flood in annually. The city's Alvaro Obregón Strip pulsed with neon. Bars like Los Sombreros, Sgt. Pepper's, and Hard Rock Cafe rattled with music, laughter, and the clang of tequila shots. Local street vendors hawked tortillas and churros. Souvenir stalls glowed amid the chaos, and the smell of grilled meat hung in the humid air. Spring breakers came for one reason: cheap adventure. For so many, it was a night that felt like rebellion. No ID checks, very little law enforcement interference, and plenty of freedom. But underneath the party, across darkened neighborhoods beyond the tourist district, another world lurked. A world of cartel power, smuggled cash, and whispered rumors of occult rituals. Mark Kilroy's group was typical of the crowd that year. 4 friends from Texas: Mark, Bradley Moore, Bill Huddleston, and Brent Martin, driving through the foggy night from Austin to South Padre. Now, their plan was simple: sunbathe, relax, meet people, and escape for a few nights into the neon-lit chaos of Matamoros. Their routine? Wake up under the sun, head to the beach, attend the Miss Tan Line contest behind the Sheraton, nap at the hotel, and cross into Mexico after dinner. On its surface, Matamoros in 1989 was wild, electric, and inviting. But beneath the neon and tequila, something far darker waited. And Mark Kilroy found himself caught in its path. Before his name became attached to the headlines, before the desert graves and whispered rumors of black magic, Mark Kilroy was just a kid from a small Texas town with a sharp mind, a kind heart, and dreams that reached far beyond the horizon. Mark James Kilroy was born on March 5, 1968, in Chicago, Illinois. But soon after, his parents, James and Helen Kilroy, moved their young family to Texas in search of something quieter, something steadier. They found it in Santa Fe, a modest town tucked just outside Houston, where Mark and his younger brother Keith would grow up surrounded by fields, Friday night football, and the kind of neighbors who all knew your name. Mark's father, Jim, was a chemical engineer, methodical and intelligent, and his mother, Helen, volunteered as a paramedic. It was a family grounded in service, education, and faith. The Kilroys were devout Catholics who attended Mass regularly at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in nearby Hitchcock. And Mark, even as a teenager, carried that faith with him. He was the kind of young man who kept a Bible in his backpack, thumbing through its pages in between homework and class, holding fast to something bigger than himself. He wasn't just smart, he was gifted. Mark excelled in school, ranking 14th in his class of 210 at Santa Fe High. He was a natural leader, involved in student council, and an active member of the Boy Scouts of America. But he wasn't all books and badges. Mark had a competitive streak, too. He played baseball, basketball, and golf with his friends, balancing academics and athletics with an ease that made it look effortless. After high school, he followed his passion for sports to Tarleton State University on a basketball scholarship. He joined the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity and embraced the rhythm of college life. But something deeper was calling. Mark knew he was meant for more. So he left the court behind and transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, determined to become a doctor. He was laser-focused on pre-med, preparing for the MCATs and building the kind of future he had always envisioned, one rooted in compassion, curiosity, and care. Mark was the kind of guy people trusted. He was responsible, cautious, and grounded. He liked to have fun. Yes, he'd enjoy a drink with friends, but he steered clear of drugs. He thought about the consequences. He looked out for people. And beneath the quiet confidence was someone who made others feel safe just by being around. That spring of 1989, he was 21 years old. A young man with a purpose, a mind built for medicine, a heart built for service. When Mark's close friends suggested a road trip to South Padre Island for spring break, Mark said yes. It wasn't his usual scene, but it sounded fun. Beaches, sunshine, a little time to relax and reset. It would be a short trip, 4 days at most, and the plan was simple. Stay in South Padre, cross the border for a night or two in Matamoros, and then head home. Nothing out of the ordinary. But behind the music, the neon, and the crowds of carefree students, something darker was waiting. And this is where everything changed, because Mark Kilroy never came back. And what happened next would unravel into one of the most nightmarish and surreal stories in modern crime history. By mid-March 1989, spring break was buzzing on college campuses across the country. For Mark Kilroy, it was a welcome pause from the pressure of pre-med life at the University of Texas. The long hours of study and looming MCAT exam would have to wait, at least for a few days. It was the start of a trip that should have been routine. Instead, it became the last time anyone would ever see him. On March 9th, Mark's childhood friend, Bradley Moore, finished an exam early at Texas A&M and headed straight for Austin to pick him up. The two close friends had been planning the trip for weeks. After reuniting, they drove to Mark's hometown of Santa Fe to collect two more friends, Bill Huddleston and Brent Martin. With all four together, they set off down the foggy Texas highways toward the southern tip of the state, where South Padre Island was already beginning to stir with the first waves of spring break travelers. They pulled in just before midnight and checked into the Sheraton the next morning. Now at first, the island was quiet. Only a few early arrivals dotted the beaches. But each day brought thousands more. Within the weekend, South Padre was brimming with college students from all over the U.S., drawn by the cheap beer, warm weather, and that promise of freedom. Beer companies staged elaborate promotional events, surf simulations, outdoor concerts, free long-distance phone booths, even casting calls for TV spots. Mark and Bradley made use of those free phones and each called home that first day to check in with their parents. Everything was going great. Later that night, the group met some Purdue University students and partied with them into the early morning hours. A rhythm quickly set in. Mornings on the beach, tanning under the hot sun. Afternoons, watching the Miss Tan Line contest behind the hotel. Evenings filled with plans, parties, and the occasional spontaneous decision, like heading across the border into Mexico. That Sunday, after a nap back at the hotel, Mark and his friends decided to cross into Matamoros for the night. They stopped at a Sonic for dinner and ran into a group of women from the University of Kansas who were also headed to Mexico. The two groups caravanned to Brownsville, parked near the Gateway International Bridge, and walked across the border on foot as the sun set. Matamoros at night was electric. Bright lights, pulsing music, the air thick with heat and movement. American spring breakers packed the sidewalks of Alvaro Obregon Street, drawn by the low prices and looser laws. That night, Mark and his friends landed at a bar called Sergeant Pepper's, but eventually split from the Kansas girls and returned to South Padre just before dawn. And it wasn't their last trip across the border. On Monday, March 13th, after another day on the beach and another round of Miss Tan Line, Mark attended a condo party to catch up with one of his old fraternity brothers. Later that night, around 10:30, the four friends once again decided to cross into Matamoros. But this night was different. Matamoros was at its peak. Over 15,000 American tourists flooded the streets, shoulder to shoulder, stumbling from bar to bar, shouting over music, drinks clinking, beer flying. The crowds were massive, disorienting, and wild. Mark and his friends, feeling the crush of bodies and noise, decided to skip the long lines and enter the bar with the shortest wait, Los Sombreros. But they didn't stay long. Eventually, they made their way to the London pub, rebranded for spring break as Hard Rock Cafe. Inside, it was chaos, deafening music, lights spinning, beer raining from above. Mark was last seen chatting with a woman, possibly one of the Miss Tan Line contestants. At around 2 a.m., Bill suggested they head back to the States. As the group stepped out of the bar and into the crowded street, they spotted Mark leaning against a car, still deep in conversation. The crowds were shifting now, some heading toward the border, others splintering off into darkened corners of the city. The group began to separate in the congestion, swept up in the stream of people. Bradley and Brent crossed first, walking to Garcia's, a popular tourist shop near the bridge. Bill lingered behind to catch up with Mark. Mark had stopped at the steps of a small house to say goodbye to the woman. He was just standing there, calm, casual, waiting. Bill, feeling the effects of the night, ducked into a nearby alley to relieve himself, telling Mark he'd be right back. But when Bill rejoined Bradley and Brent a few minutes later, Mark was gone, just like that. They waited, called out for him, searched nearby blocks. Maybe he wandered ahead. Maybe he crossed without them. But by 4:30 a.m., when the bars had closed and the streets had finally cleared, there was still no sign of him. They crossed the border, hoping to find him waiting by the car in Brownsville. But the car was empty. They waited. Still, nothing. Eventually, they drove back to the hotel in South Padre, thinking maybe he had left with someone else. Maybe he was already asleep upstairs. But the next morning, his bed was still untouched. Mark Kilroy had vanished without a word, without a witness, without a trace. As the hours passed, fear crept in. By late morning, his friends made the call. They reported him missing to local police. But they couldn't have imagined what the investigation would reveal, or the horrifying world that had swallowed their friend whole. Now, first, the disappearance of Mark was treated the way most spring break vanishings are, like a temporary misstep in a week of heavy partying. College students went missing in Matamoros all the time. Most of them resurfaced a day or two later, hungover and embarrassed, with a hazy recollection of where they'd been. But this time, something felt different. Mark wasn't the kind of kid who disappeared. He was responsible, smart, and always in control. His friends knew that, his parents knew that, and soon The authorities began to sense it too. Mark was just one of dozens of people who disappeared in or around Matamoros since the start of the year. But unlike the others, Mark had a powerful connection back in the United States. His uncle, Ken Kilroy, worked for the U.S. Customs Service in Los Angeles. When word of Mark's disappearance reached him, wheels began to turn fast. A police task force was immediately assembled in Brownsville, and both U.S. and Mexican authorities launched a coordinated search. The city of Matamoros, concerned about its tourism image, tried to pass the blame, suggesting that Mark had gone missing in Brownsville instead. But his friends firmly pushed back. Mark had vanished in Mexico, and they weren't about to let anyone rewrite the story. Mexican federal police pledged their support and assigned agents to work alongside U.S. investigators. Together, they fanned out through the chaotic border city, questioning bar staff, combing through jails and hospitals, and chasing down every scrap of information they could find. One of the investigators even hired a hypnotist to see if any suppressed memories might surface. Under hypnosis, Bradley Moore recalled seeing a Hispanic man with a scar across his face wearing a blue plaid shirt talking to Mark just before he vanished. The man had said something strange, something like, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" But the details were too blurry, too uncertain. None of the friends could pinpoint the exact moment when Mark disappeared. So the theory shifted. Maybe Mark had been kidnapped for robbery, or maybe ransom. But there were no demands, no phone calls, no messages, just silence. Custom agents joined the search. U.S. helicopters and terrain vehicles scoured the banks of the Rio Grande River. Volunteers handed out over 20,000 flyers across Texas and Mexico. Mark's parents traveled to the Rio Grande Valley and personally offered a $15,000 reward for any information that could lead to his return. The case drew attention from the Texas governor, the attorney general, and even a U.S. senator. But the silence held. On March 26th, America's Most Wanted aired Mark's story, broadcasting his photo and details nationwide. The case exploded into public consciousness. Tips flooded in, letters and phone calls with possible sightings, leads, ideas, but none of them brought investigators any closer to the truth. Eventually, Mark's parents returned to Santa Fe. With heavy hearts, they withdrew him from his college classes. Hope, though not gone, was starting to dim. And then, everything changed. On April 1st, 1989, Mexican federal officers were manning a routine drug checkpoint along Federal Highway 2 near Matamoros when a truck blew past them without stopping. It had just crossed the U.S. border and was headed toward the desert. Rather than chase it immediately, the officers tailed the vehicle from a distance using an unmarked car. The truck turned off the main highway and rumbled down a dusty road leading to a secluded stretch of land known as Rancho Santa Elena. There, they waited. The driver, identified later as Serafin Hernandez Garcia, the nephew of a local drug lord, spent about a half an hour at the ranch before heading back to town. Now, the officers didn't stop him. Not yet. They had a bigger plan. When they entered the property, they didn't find drugs. Not at first. What they found was something else. Ritual objects, strange altars, bones, and bloodstains. Something dark had happened there. Something older than the drug trade. Over the next few days, police began quietly building a case. They used informants in Matamoros to gather intel on the Hernandez family and the people who came and went from Rancho Santa Elena. By April 9th, they were ready to make their move. In a coordinated raid, they arrested Serafin, his uncle Elio Hernandez Rivera, and several others, David Serna Valdez, Sergio Martinez Salinas, and the ranch's caretaker, Domingo Reyes Bustamante. First, the men seemed relaxed, even smug, but under pressure, cracks started forming. One of the ranch caretakers was shown a photo of Mark Kilroy. He paused, then said he'd seen him. Days later, Serafin broke. In a chilling confession, he told authorities that Mark was dead. He'd been murdered as part of a ritualistic human sacrifice carried out by a cult led by a man named Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, a drug trafficker and self-proclaimed high priest who believed that human blood would protect his criminal empire. Serafin said Adolfo had ordered his followers to bring him an Anglo male. So that night in Matamoros, they mingled with spring breakers, looking for someone who fit the profile. And that's when they found Mark. As Mark stood on the sidewalk chatting with friends, he was lured to a waiting truck. One of the men approached and said, "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" The same line Bradley remembered under hypnosis. As Mark leaned closer, the men grabbed him. He struggled and broke free, but 2 blocks later, another vehicle intercepted him. They shoved Mark inside, handcuffed him, and drove him through the back streets to Rancho Santa Elena. He spent the night in the car. In the morning, a caretaker fed him bread, eggs, and water. That afternoon, Adolfo Constanzo arrived. They taped Mark's mouth shut and led him across the field to a small shack. But what happened next is almost too horrific to speak out loud. Through the night of March 15th, Mark was tortured, sexually assaulted, and finally killed by a machete. Adolfo struck him at the base of the skull, believing the act would fill him with power. They boiled his brain in a nganga, a cast iron cauldron used in Palo Mayombe rituals. His legs were severed to make the burial easier. A wire was inserted into his spine so that later, after decomposition, the bones could be pulled from the ground and worn as necklaces for future rituals. It was the work of a death cult masquerading as a drug cartel, a nightmare hiding in plain sight. On April 11th, investigators returned to the ranch with Serafin and 4 others in custody. Under armed supervision, the men dug into the soil and unearthed a mass grave. 15 mutilated bodies were pulled from the earth. Some were cartel rivals, others were unidentified. But one set of remains, missing its legs and the skull cracked at the base, matched Mark Kilroy's dental records. Inside the shack, authorities found the nganga, filled with human brain matter, a goat's head, chicken feet, a turtle shell, a horseshoe, coins, and animal blood. Now, there were no signs of cannibalism, but the evidence told its own story. They also seized 243 pounds of marijuana, 108 grams of cocaine, 12 firearms, and 11 vehicles, some with mobile phones, which was quite the luxury at the time. The press descended on Matamoros. The public was horrified. At an impromptu press conference, Elio Hernandez Rivera told reporters that he was an ordained executioner in the cult and showed off arrow-shaped scars burned into his chest, marks that signified permission to perform human sacrifice. 2 weeks later, Mexican federal police returned to the ranch. They brought a curandero, or a folk healer, to cleanse the shack with prayer and salt before dousing it in gasoline and setting it on fire, then erecting a wooden cross above their ashes. Officially, the action was never explained, but a source close to the investigation later said it was spiritual warfare. Burning the shack, they believed, would destabilize Adolfo. And it worked. The next morning, upon seeing it burned on national television, he flew into a rage. As the sun rose over Matamoros on April 11, 1989, the air felt heavy with something unspeakable. Mark Kilroy's body had just been unearthed, along with the dismembered remains of more than a dozen other victims, at a ranch that looked deceptively ordinary from the outside. But inside that property, deep in the shack used as a ceremonial room, was a scene so horrific, so steeped in brutality and ritual, that it haunted even the most seasoned officers. And as news of the human sacrifices made international headlines, one thing was terrifyingly clear. The killers were still out there. That same day, as authorities processed the gruesome discovery at Rancho Santa Elena, the cult's ringleader, Adolfo, he was already gone. He had vanished like smoke, slipping away with a few of his most trusted followers. First to a Holiday Inn in Brownsville, Texas, then boarding a flight to Mexico City with Sarah Aldrete, the so-called high priestess, and 3 loyal disciples, Martin Quintana Rodriguez, Omar Francisco Oria Ochoa, and Alvaro de Leon Valdez. What followed was one of the most intense and surreal manhunts Mexico and the United States had ever seen. The U.S. and Mexican authorities, now fully aware of the supernatural horror Adolfo had inflicted, launched an international search. Agents scoured known hideouts, they wiretapped phones, they chased tips from Chicago to Miami. Rumors spread like wildfire that Adolfo had fled to visit his mother in Florida, that Sarah was hiding in plain sight in a school in the Rio Grande Valley, even that she had vowed to kidnap 1 child for every cult member arrested. Panic grew. In Clovis, New Mexico, a convenience store clerk reported seeing a couple that matched their descriptions. In Brownsville, Adolfo was reportedly spotted driving a black 1989 Mercedes-Benz. In Matamoros, police raided Sarah's house and discovered a blood-stained altar surrounded by religious icons and ritual tools. Meanwhile, back in Mexico City, the shadows shifted. Behind the scenes, Mexican authorities quietly made connections between the Matamoros killings and a series of unsolved murders in Mexico City dating back to 1987. They consulted folk healers and even local witches, who suggested that Adolfo had taken refuge somewhere within the capital's dense, chaotic boroughs. Police flooded the area. 16 officers were dispatched to comb through the narrow streets, alleys, and apartment complexes. At a local supermarket, a shoemaker claimed to have seen a woman who looked eerily like Sarah. Another man drew attention when he tried to purchase a large quantity of groceries using US dollars. Police tailed him to an apartment on Rio Sena Street. They watched, they waited, and by the end of that week, they had their man. It was Alvaro de Leon Valdez, and he was buying supplies for Adolfo. On May 6, 1989, they made their move. At twilight, police surrounded the Rio Sena apartment complex. They waited until traffic quieted. Then, just as they prepared to strike, a black vehicle pulled up out front. Officers moved in to question the occupants. Now, inside the apartment, Adolfo saw flashing lights and uniformed men through the blinds, and he snapped. He opened fire from the window, sending a barrage of bullets into the street. He threw golden coins and paper bills out the window like a deranged offering to the spirits. He stuffed bundles of cash into the stove and set them on fire. Smoke filled the apartment. For 45 minutes, he fought like a man possessed. But eventually, the gunfire ceased. Adolfo realized what he had always feared. His magic had run out. There'd be no more protection, no more spells. The spirits had abandoned him. He turned to Alvaro and gave one final command: kill me and Martin. Now, Alvaro hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to do it. But Adolfo, now hysterical, hit him in the face and warned him if he didn't obey, he would suffer in hell for eternity. Then, without fear, Adolfo embraced Martin, who was said to be his lover, and pulled him close. Alvaro opened fire with a machine gun. By the time police breached the smoke-filled apartment, Adolfo and Martin were dead, entwined in a final gruesome act. Sarah ran to the door screaming, "Adolfo is dead." Her reign as the cult's so-called high priestess had come to a bloody, tragic end. But her story was far from over. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to rewrite the narrative. She denied involvement in the killings. She claimed she was unaware of any murders until she saw the headlines. That she wasn't a cult member, but a prisoner. That she wasn't one of Adolfo's lovers, just a follower. But it was too late. Authorities didn't buy it, and neither did the public. Every single cult member was arrested and held without bail. The crimes were too heinous. The evidence? too overwhelming. In August, Omar Araya was hospitalized with a fatal AIDS diagnosis. He died less than a year later. On June 2nd, a federal police chief was indicted for drug trafficking and implicated by cult members. But he denied everything, saying he only sought Adolfo's help to rid him of spirits. He was never charged with murder. Alvaro was sentenced to 30 years for killing Adolfo and Martin. Others were charged for separate murders. The ranch caretaker, Reyes Bustamante, was convicted of a cover-up, but later released after posting bond. In the years that followed, sentences were handed down like falling dominoes. On May 3, 1994, Sarah was sentenced to 62 years in prison. Other key members received 67 years each. Despite the gruesome finality at Rancho Santa Elena, the story didn't end with their convictions. The legacy of this cult and those who survived behind bars continued to cast long, unsettling shadows. Behind heavily guarded walls, Sarah, or La Madrina, still serves her decades-long sentence in a Mexican prison. But she remains defiant of her conviction. In a 2003 interview, Sarah spoke to the press, tears in her eyes, insisting she had never harmed anyone, including Mark Kilroy. She claimed investigators could never truly understand what happened at Santa Elena because the key evidence, being Adolfo Constanzo himself, was dead. Sarah further alleged that authorities hid the names of famous people involved with Adolfo, protecting themselves by obscuring the truth. And she had no remorse, saying she believed in God and would not apologize for crimes she swore she had never committed. A year later, she spoke again, this time accusing authorities of torturing her until she confessed. She described being stripped naked, blindfolded, suspended upside down, and having her toenails pulled out. She claimed she was beaten so severely that doctors told her she would never be able to have children. Sarah also released an autobiography in the early 2000s, offering her version of events. She claimed she initially met Adolfo in Mexico City, but was then taken hostage by the group. She and others in the inner circle had no idea what was happening in Matamoros until the FBI and Mexican police actively began hunting them. She said they went into hiding not out of guilt, but fear for their lives. Her memoir lays out graphic allegations of psychological torture, sexual violence, and a biased trial held without jury, all taking place behind closed doors. She insisted that Adolfo was executed by police, and that burning the shack at Santa Elena was a deliberate move to destroy evidence of the real killers. But for Mark Kilroy's family, and the families of the other victims, justice can never be fully served. Their loved ones are gone forever. The nightmares will always linger. Because this wasn't just a cult. It wasn't just drugs, or murder, or even the occult. This was a descent into something darker. A reminder that real evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it smiles at you in the daylight. Sometimes it wears the face of a classmate, or a priestess, or a prophet. And sometimes it invites you into its circle and never lets you leave. Spring break should be unforgettable for all the right reasons. The road trip, the beach, the feeling of freedom. It's a time to let go of school stress, reconnect with friends, and soak up a little sun before finals take over. But sometimes, in all that excitement, we forget the one thing that matters most: staying safe. Mark Kilroy's story is a devastating reminder that even a trip filled with laughter and good intentions can take a dark turn. He didn't do anything reckless. He wasn't looking for danger. He was just a 21-year-old college student enjoying spring break with his friends until he vanished. So, if you're heading out for spring break, especially if you're traveling internationally to a border town like Matamoros, here are a few things to keep in mind. Now, these aren't meant to ruin the fun. They're meant to protect it. First, stick together. Always. Make it your golden rule. Nobody goes anywhere alone, no matter how close the hotel is, how short the walk, or how tempting the invitation. Predators look for people who are isolated. Don't give them that opportunity. Know where you're going. And crossing into another country, even just a few steps across the border, means you're playing by a different set of rules. The laws are different. The protections are different. And in some places, law enforcement isn't always reliable. Research the area before you go. Understand the risks. And don't assume you'll be treated the same way you would be back home. And skip the drugs. Seriously, even if it's just weed or just one time. In places like Matamoros, drugs are deeply connected to organized crime. And getting caught in that world can be deadly. Now, Mark wasn't using drugs, but he was taken by people who were part of a drug cult. Sometimes being in the wrong place is all it takes. Drink smart. And that means knowing your limits. That means keeping an eye on your drink at all times. And that means not accepting drinks from strangers, no matter how friendly they seem. Alcohol is the number one way people get separated from their group, or manipulated into situations they'd never be in otherwise. Use your phones as a safety tool. Keep it charged. Share your location with a friend. Drop a pin before you go out. Send a quick text to someone back home, just so someone knows where you are. Now, these things might seem small, but they can make a big difference if something goes wrong. And know the emergency numbers. 911 doesn't work everywhere. Look up the local emergency number before you travel. Know the name and address of where you're staying. And learn a few basic phrases in the local language, just in case you need help. And of course, stay with your group. Watch each other's backs. Don't wander off alone. Pay attention to your surroundings. Whether you're in Matamoros or Miami, Cancun, or South Padre. Because no one ever thinks it will happen to them until it does. Mark Kilroy was just 21 years old, a pre-med student, an athlete, a loyal friend. He had his whole life ahead of him, a life of purpose, one he hoped would be spent helping others, healing them. But his trip to Matamoros in 1989 ended in tragedy. And though the world may remember the horror of what happened to him, the cult, the brutality, the senseless loss, his family refused to let that be the final word in his story. Just 2 months after Mark's body was found, his parents, Helen and Jim Kilroy, made a choice. They could have drowned in their grief. Instead, they built something. They founded the Mark Kilroy Foundation, a living tribute to the son they lost and the future he never got to fulfill. Now, through this foundation, they began educating young people about the dangers of drug use, something Mark was deeply passionate about long before he set foot in Mexico. His dream was to become a doctor. Now, through this program, his name is helping save lives. Since 1994, the foundation has worked hand in hand with SAFE, substance abuse-free environment, creating programs that promote prevention, education, and healthy choices. During the school year, they offer guidance and mentorship. And in the summer, they provide more than 500 children with free outdoor activities, like swimming, archery, fishing, golf, and tennis. Activities Mark would have loved. Places where kids feel safe, seen, and supported. Helen and Jim didn't just honor their son's memory. They turned his loss into a movement. They began speaking to students and young travelers, offering practical advice about safety during spring break. Stay in groups, never wander off alone, look out for each other, and respect the laws of the places you visit. They understood something critical, something many forget. Tragedy doesn't just happen in faraway places. It can happen anywhere. The best protection we have is each other. Helen Kilroy passed away in 2014 after a battle with ALS. Jim followed her in 2024. But their legacy and marks, it lives on. It lives in every teen who chooses to say no, in every young person who chooses to travel more safely, and in every parent who reminds their child that life can change in an instant. But love, purpose, and memory, those never fade. Mark Kilroy's story is a hard one, but it's also a reminder of how light can still shine in the darkest places. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod, and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/The Last Trip Podcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.